In this video, let's understand what is an ORM. ORM stands for Object to Relational Mapping or Object Relational Mapping. Now with that we see three words: object, relational and mapping. Object is the one that you typically use with any programming language. When we have classes, they will act as an object. When we have classes in our programming language, that will act as an object. After that, relational stands for Relational Database Management System or RDBMS, like a SQL Server or any other relational database. Finally, we have mapping, which will bridge the object and tables together. So mapping will be responsible to map your object and tables together and vice versa. If that does not make complete sense right now, do not worry. As we progress with the course, everything will start making more sense. Now ORM is a technique that will allow you to query and manipulate data from a database using an object-oriented paradigm. When we talk about ORM, most people refer to that as a library that implements the object relational mapping techniques, which stands for ORM. Unless you have worked exclusively with NoSQL database, you have likely worked with SQL queries. They look something like this, where you do not use an ORM. You will be writing your own SQL query, you will be executing them, retrieving the data, and storing them. This is how a typical non-ORM system would retrieve the data. Right here you can see multiple lines of code. That can be simplified into a single line of code with the help of an ORM. Now do not go with the syntax here because syntax will depend on what ORM you are using. But typically an ORM will simplify the query to something like this, in which we have a books table, which will be the object. On that you will execute a query, and on the parameter you can filter on some columns and more condition. So you can see how simplified it is with the help of an ORM. Object relational mapping is the idea of being able to write queries like the one you see here, as well as much more complicated queries using the object-oriented paradigm of your preferred programming language. Long story short, we are trying to interact with our database using our language of choice instead of SQL. So in this case, we will be using C# or .NET programming language to interact with the ORM when we use Entity Framework. That being said, let me also take a look at few advantages that ORM brings to the table. One of the main benefits is that you do not have to write SQL queries. You write it directly in the language that you are already using, like we will see in the upcoming videos. Main advantage is that you get to write in the language that you are already using right now. SQL is a ridiculously powerful language. Most of the programmers don't write in it often. If I had to write SQL queries or stored procedures, I would definitely do that. But every time when I write a SQL query, the back of the mind I'm not thinking about making it optimized. If it is a small table, I might select more records, or I might write a SQL that is not completely efficient. But when we use an ORM, chances are high that the query that ORM will use to select or update some data will be more efficient than if a developer would typically have to write. On top of that, ORM will abstract away the database system so that switching database is not that difficult. And then many of the queries that you will write with the help of ORM, well, technically not queries, but the commands that you will use to perform operation using ORM will be much better in performance than if you had to write the query yourself. ORM will save you a lot of time when you are writing the SQL and wrappers around that. Other advantage is when you have to create table or create database models, it is much simpler because from models, ORM can directly generate the tables. There are quite a few advantages of using an ORM. Our main focus on this course will be on Entity Framework Core ORM, which is a cross-platform and open source object relational mapping.